Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, cloud of lighted incense, pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha. I respectfully bow to our own teacher, Sakyamuni Buddha, the future-born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom, Manjushri Bodhisattva, great practice, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great power, Mahastamaprada Bodhisattva, great vow, Ksitigarva Bodhisattva, all the Bodhisattvas in the great pure ocean. Good morning. Thank you for being here. It looks like my feed on my computer that I monitor with has frozen up. Hopefully yours has not. Give me 1 second. I'm going to click refresh on mine, see if it'll start back up. I think it's my tablet. I hope that you're not experiencing the same issue. And I hope I'll be able to read your questions. Anyway, so I'm going to talk today about self-compassion. So it was either last Sunday or Wednesday night, I talked about compassion, which is a very common topic in Buddhism. You hear about compassion frequently. And it occurred to me that I hadn't talked about the idea of having compassion for yourself for a while. And it's a good topic. It's important to take care of yourself. It's important to see that we are also suffering and understand the sources of that and all of that. So let me give you a little bit of background on where I'm coming from with this topic. So almost 30 years ago, I guess. Maybe more than 30 years ago. Gosh, I'm getting old. I was in Orlando. I was in a meeting of a rational recovery, which at the time was very new, and it was an alternative to 12-step programs for people who wanted to recover from alcohol and drug dependency, but who had issues with the God-centered approach that AA and similar groups had. And so I'll tell you the whole story about that one of these days. It's not that important to this particular discussion. But at the time, I had stopped drinking and I was doing all kinds of stuff to try to deal with emotional issues that were involved with that, but also things that I had been kind of self-medicating for a long time. And so I was attending these rational recovery meetings, and I was sitting with a little sort of Zen group that had started at this Unitarian church with a rational recovery mat. So if you ever spend much time around Zen people, you'll eventually encounter this quote, which is from Dogen, who founded the Soto Zen school of Japanese Buddhism, the one that I'm in. To study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. When actualized by myriad things, the body and mind, as well as the body and minds of others, drop away. No trace of enlightenment remains, and this no trace continues endlessly. So when I first read that, it really resonated with me. But at that point, I had no idea what it meant. I just knew that it clicked with me on some level. And the whole idea of the not self teaching in Buddhism and this concept of self is this kind of sort of nebulous thing and not really a discrete thing, was clicking with me, but I had a challenge. It was a challenge for me to understand what it meant and why it was important. So anyway, this particular group, Rational Recovery Group, had been meeting for a few months. And on that day, we had our first visit from a psychologist who was kind of took us on as an advisor named Philip Tate. And he had agreed that he would serve as our mentor and advisor. And so there was this woman there who was in her late 20s probably, and she was talking about struggles she'd have with alcohol and drugs and eating disorders and a whole bunch of kind of compulsive behaviors. And as she was speaking, it became clear that she was feeling kind of desperate, and she started crying. And so Dr. Tate just kind of stopped and said, just, tell me what you're feeling right now. And she said, well, I feel terrible. She said, terrible how? And she said, well, I feel really bad about myself. I think I do these things because I have low self-esteem. And Phil stopped a second. He said, self-esteem. Well, self-esteem is a sickness. He didn't say low self-esteem was a sickness. He didn't say good self-esteem was a sickness. He said self-esteem itself was a sickness. And on a deep level that I couldn't explain yet, I got a glimmer, I think, of what Buddhism means when it talks about the self. And what Dogen meant when he said to study the self is to forget the self. But even then, it was still pretty elusive to me. So at the time, the idea that there was anything wrong with the idea of esteeming oneself flew in the face of conventional wisdom. In 1969, there was a psychotherapist named Nathaniel Branden, and he had published a paper called The Psychology of Self-Esteem. And in that paper, he announced that feeling good about yourself was the secret to success in life. And this launched this mass movement toward doing everything possible to make sure that people, especially kids, were free from any threat to their self-esteem. And so as a result, there were new games designed to protect children from having to experience a loss and consequently perhaps a loss of their self-image and so on. But it turned out over time, this idea of self-esteem is important, didn't really live up to the hype. And about a decade ago or so, the Association for Psychological Science, which is a nonprofit dedicated to the advancement of science and psychology, asked one of their members, Roy Baumeister, PhD, to review the studies that supported the idea that self-esteem was kind of the be-all and end-all of mental illness. And at that time, or mental wellness, rather. And Baumeister was a well-known proponent of the self-esteem model. But after he and his team looked at a whole bunch of studies, thousands and thousands of studies, they determined that very few of them met very rigorous standards for research. About 200 of them did, and after reviewing those 200, he concluded that good self-esteem didn't really predict high grades, it didn't predict career achievement, any of that stuff that he and his colleagues had previously believed that high self-esteem would predict. High self-esteem didn't reduce alcohol dependency, it didn't lower violence. Researchers learned that highly aggressive, violent people tend to think very highly of themselves, which contradicted the prevailing view that aggression was a compensation for feelings of low self-esteem. And this psychologist, Baumeister, called his findings the biggest disappointment of his career. So, look, to be fair, we should recognize that the self-esteem movement came about as a reaction to the realization that kids don't respond well to being beaten up on over their grades and achievement, and that being self-critical and perfectionistic isn't good for you, isn't healthy or helpful. So if that's not helpful and if self-esteem isn't really helpful, then what is? What's the alternative? What do we do when we feel badly toward ourselves for messing up, or we deal with things that are tied to lower self-esteem, like anxiety or depression? Well, this is Buddhism, so we're going to talk about the middle way. The Buddha said some things 2,500 years ago that can help us with this today. And some contemporary psychologists have found a lot of commonality between what the Buddha taught and what research suggests can be helpful. There's a lot of discussion today about the importance of being compassionate, and not just in Buddhism, but elsewhere. And it is important. It's important to the functioning of society, and there are spiritual and psychological benefits of having compassion toward others. But what about being kind to ourselves and having compassion for ourselves? And it turns out a lot of us show very little compassion for ourselves, and that causes us great emotional distress. So there's another psychologist, Kristen Neff, PhD, started studying this at the University of Texas in Austin, and she has since become the leading proponent of what she calls self-compassion. So she got interested in Buddhism in the late 1990s. I don't know if she identifies as Buddhist, but she got interested in it anyway, and started thinking about the idea of self-compassion while learning to practice insight meditation. And she realized in the process that we often make very harsh, cruel self-judgments about ourselves that we would rarely make about others, especially about people that we care about. But she's found that some people are capable of being kind to themselves. And she found that it was possible to treat yourself with the same kind, caring, support, and understanding that you would show to someone that you care about. And so she decided she would study this. And she found that people who have kind of self-compassionate tendencies tend to feel emotionally more positive, and they tend to be healthier. They're more likely to exercise, they are more likely to see their doctors regularly, better able to watch what they eat, practice safer sex, all kinds of healthier things. And they're also kinder to other people, including like their relationship partners. So they tend to be more supportive of other people in general and have better social connections. And better social connections tends to result in our having a higher sense of well-being for ourselves. Narcissism, on the other hand, is associated with self-esteem. The narcissist has rated himself or herself so highly that other people don't matter very much, if at all. But with self-compassion, you don't have to be the center of the universe. We identify more with others, so when we suffer or fail, we're able to recognize that other people also suffer or fail. And everyone has strengths and weaknesses, so we share those attributes with others. So instead of having to feel better than other people in order to feel good about ourselves, we can feel a greater connectedness to others. So being compassionate toward yourself and having high self-esteem are both emotionally positive. I mean, it feels good to have high self-esteem. It feels good to be compassionate toward yourself. But self-esteem is a matter of giving yourself a good rating. I am good. And this is where Dr. Tate was talking about self-esteem as being kind of not a healthy thing. If we identify ourselves and rate it as good or bad, then that's fundamentally irrational. But there's a downside to it. I mean, if I say, oh, look at how successful I am, I must be a great person, then what if I do something bad or mess up in some way? Then am I not a good person? Do I turn into a bad person? Or do I deny what has actually happened myself, what I've done and its consequences, because I don't want to take a hit to this glowing self-image that I have? So for the most part, most people esteem ourselves when we succeed. And so unless we manage to completely overlook our failures or blame them on other people or whatever, we respond to our failures and mistakes with low self-esteem. So having compassion for yourself is without judgment. You don't have to decide whether you're good or bad. You simply recognize that you're suffering and you respond to that with kindness. Much like if you were talking to a friend who failed at a big project or something, what would you tell him or her? Would you tell yourself something similar when you fail? So Neff, the psychologist that I mentioned, now teaches her students and others how to develop compassion toward themselves. And she identifies three main ways to be compassionate toward ourselves. Number one, to be kind to ourselves, be understanding toward ourselves, and to be mindful. So a lot of people have trouble being kind to themselves. We have a tendency to be self-judgmental. So when we fail, we judge ourselves a failure. I've heard people come to me with issues and say really cruel things about themselves. So self-compassion means you're warm and supportive to yourself. Think about how you might console a friend who'd messed up big time at work. Would you say, yeah, boy, you were a real idiot? I mean, some people would, but hopefully you wouldn't. Probably you'd say something consoling. So you can do the same for yourself. Doesn't mean overlook the consequences of what you've done. It just means don't make yourself out to be a bad person or an idiot or whatever because you screwed up. So we all know this line from poet Alexander Pope: to err is human, to forgive divine. But we often fail to forgive ourselves as readily as we forgive loved ones and friends. So the next step in the process is to be understanding toward yourself. Often when we mess up, we think of ourselves as the only people in the world who make mistakes. Nobody else has ever made a mistake as bad as this. But when we think realistically about that, we recognize that all human beings make mistakes, and some of them make really big mistakes. So we can work on accepting ourselves with all of our humanness. So if you practice self-acceptance, then you're inherently worthy, with your self-image defined more by your purpose. So your sense of self-worth can be more stable, or at least more resilient. You can fail without being a failure. And since you're less likely to be you're less likely to be reactive in a negative way. So since your sense of self-worth doesn't hinge on externals, you're less likely to take things personally when they don't go your way. You're less likely to get angry when you encounter obstacles and things like that, because it becomes less that the world is all about you, right? So the third practice then is related to mindfulness, to being aware that you're suffering. If you're too caught up in problem solving and stuff, you may deny or ignore your feelings or not offer yourself compassion. Practicing meditation and mindfulness tends to increase self-compassion. There are a number of studies have shown that self-compassion increases when people participate in things like MBSR programs. And in fact, I've seen some researchers suggest that that might be one of the big contributors to the feeling of enhanced well-being that comes about from doing a meditation program like that. A practice that emphasizes awareness and the development of our mental states will likely increase our ability to skillfully react to stress when it arises in our mind. So probably a lot of people encounter this idea of self-compassion and self-acceptance and think it's too soft, or it's unlikely to motivate you to excel or something like that. You know, I've had a number of these conversations with people who are very perfectionistic and really down on themselves when they're not, doing everything just right and that kind of thing. But when we talk about this realistically, we realize that to be self-critical or judgmental is really counterproductive. You're a lot more likely to learn from your mistakes if you allow yourself to make mistakes and then don't be judgmental toward yourself as a result. And criticizing yourself is strongly linked to things like depression and anxiety. So if you're depressed, you're a lot less likely to change, to be motivated to change. You tend to lose confidence in your abilities, which makes it less likely that you're going to improve. And so trying to motivate yourself through criticism is pretty self-defeating. It makes it very difficult for you to be honest with yourself about your weaknesses. If you're going to be harsh with yourself when you find a weakness, then you're going to probably avoid facing them. And so people who do that will usually look for ways to blame others or to deflect attention from their own failures to other people or circumstances or whatever, which keeps you from recognizing your own fallibility, which keeps you from working with it. So a lot of people become very risk averse if they're not willing to fail. So if you beat up on yourself every time you fail, then you're not going to do as much because you don't want to have to take that beating you're going to give yourself. I read this article a couple of years ago about creativity by an engineer. I can't remember the fellow's name, but he was very, very productive and well known and associated with a big university someplace, and I wish I could remember who he was. So sorry. But he set himself a goal, something like having 10 new ideas every week. He didn't set himself a goal of having 10 good ideas every week. It was 10 new ideas every week. And then the next thing was something that I've heard about from other engineering contexts, the idea of fast failure. So he tests his ideas and try to fail, eliminate the bad ones as quickly as possible. I think he said something like, I try to fail at least once every day before lunch. The idea is that the quicker you fail, the quicker you move on to the next idea. And that maybe that one won't fail. And that's how you get to be a productive engineer. And I suspect that works a lot with other processes as well. I saw an interview with Paul McCartney not long ago, and he was talking about songwriting and how there are millions of songs that he and John wrote that never got anywhere because they weren't good songs. So if you can't let yourself write bad songs, you're not going to get to the good ones. So contrast that with the idea of being risk averse. If you're willing to notice your own faults and weaknesses, then you'll be willing to change them. So sometimes I'll tell my Tai Chi students something that a teacher told me a long time ago. He said, when you practice, look for your biggest weakness and then focus on that until it becomes your greatest strength. And then find your next biggest weakness and make that your strength. And eventually, you'll come full circle. Your first biggest weakness is going to be your biggest weakness again. But in the process, you grow stronger overall. So you not only learn more about yourself and what needs to be changed, but you learn more about the tools and how to use them, emotional resilience and things that you need in order to make changes. So having compassion for yourself and accepting yourself doesn't mean that you're blasé toward what you do or toward what happens. You still benefit from trying to live your life well, and that means doing what you do with commitment and attention. But rather than focus on feeling good about ourselves, we can focus on cultivating true happiness. So, I mentioned before the Buddhist teaching that says there's no self as such. There's nothing here that is inherently mine in any significant way. There's form. Form is made up of other things that came from elsewhere. It's constantly changing. The self is made of feelings and cognitions, perceptions, consciousness, none of which is really mine in the sense that I have any real control over them. I can't just will a sensation to go away or an emotion. If I get up to speak to a group and anxiety arises, I can't just make it go away. If I try, that'll probably actually amplify it. I can't will myself to stay awake forever or to see into the future or to feel a certain way or whatever, right? I didn't have to do anything to be alive. I didn't will myself into existence. And to some extent, I can influence how healthy I am and how I look and things like that, but not to a great extent. If I was fortunate enough to be born with a handsome face, fortunately I wasn't, or unfortunately enough to be born really unpleasant looking, then that's pretty much an accident. So since things aren't really mine, why in the world would I rate myself according to them? Is there anything mine that I can rate? Well, there is. There is something that I own, at least to a large extent. I own what I do. So rather than rate myself, I can rate my actions. That's something I can look at and I say, that's mine. I get to experience the consequences of that. And then I can rate them and then I can change them. And when you do that, you can accept the self as it is, warts and all. Define what you want to do then with this form in mind that you have. And then evaluate not yourself, but your success, and really living according to your purpose. So in Buddhism, our main purpose is to be an instrument of happiness for all beings. Um, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, I quote somewhat often. He's the abbot of Metta Forest Monastery in California. He's a Theravada monk. He's a very good teacher, and when it comes to these these foundational teachings and how they apply to day-to-day life. And he says this phrase I'm going to tell you is your front row seat on the question of how to bring about more happiness. May all beings be happy. So all beings are kind of out there, but you're one of them too in here. And this is the being you can have the most direct impact on. So if you learn how to be kind to yourself, it's going to be easier to be kind to other people. So that comes from Thanissaro Bhikkhu. But another thing is very difficult to do much to help others if you can't find the resources you need to be good to yourself. So I encourage you to practice with that, and I appreciate your attention. So I'm going to see if I can get my tablet to work enough that I can see if you've written any questions. I don't see any on the computer that I'm actually doing the broadcasting with, but sometimes it doesn't show up on my feed. So I'll try it here. If you've got any questions, please write. If you have them already. I'm sorry, this usually works a lot. I use this all the time, but for whatever reason, it's not working out too well today. So, Laura says, I find I'm more judgmental of myself and say hurtful things to myself that I would never think or say to anyone else. Is there a practice to get past that? Yeah, I was just talking about that. Recognize that you are a mistake-making human being, right? Think about what you might say to someone else. I mean, I've done this myself. I'm subject to these things. I'll say something in a talk I didn't really mean to say, and it'll affect somebody the wrong way, or something like that. And I'll think, well, if this was a friend who had done that, what would I say to them? That's not a bad way to approach that, and try to shift from evaluating the results of your actions rather than rating yourself. I recognize that this self-rating thing is a rabbit hole, that you'll never get out of. Also, most of us do it, so don't beat yourself up for beating yourself up, okay? If you catch yourself feeling badly because you've been overly judgmental toward yourself, okay, just stop, right? And then move on to something else. There are meditation practices you could probably apply to this. Probably the simplest thing would be when you're doing it, just try to kind of sit and see what thoughts are coming up associating with that. So, kind of the first problem with self-rating is the idea that we're rating something that, again, really isn't ours, that's constantly changing. And even if you wanted to try, what would you rate? How many bazillion characteristics do you have? Okay, and which one ones would you decide are like the 10 that you need to assign numerical values to compare yourself to others to figure out where you fit. You know, it would be just, and as soon as you figured out what those are, they're going to change, or something else would come along and go, oh, I should do that instead. So this idea of self-rating, it's really, and again, we all do it. You know, I'll screw up and go, oh man, what a screw up I am, right? Because that's the leap we make. I made a mistake. I'm a mistake making. I'm a mistake, right? I failed. I'm a failure. We don't need to do that. And you could just as easily rate yourself according to some good things. Oh, look, I do this really well. I'm better than everybody else. But they're both actually a mistake, right? A lot better to not. There's a sign at White Sands that you have probably seen, Laura. Your true life of happiness does not need a self to exist. So when we're rating ourselves, we think, well, if I could just be perfect, I could be happy. You could let go of that idea that there's an I that needs to be perfected, and instead do the things that lead to happiness. Then there wouldn't be any point, any reason to rate yourself or judge yourself, right? Now, don't judge yourself for doing that. We all do it. I do it too. Just learn to let it go quickly. So that's the only question I see. So that said, we'll go ahead and do the dedication. And if you've typed something in and it just hasn't popped up where I can see it yet, I'll answer it when I get done. And otherwise, remember that I'm here Wednesday nights on YouTube, and we have the Zoom meetings on Thursday. So there's ever something along these lines that you want to have a conversation about, show up on Thursday night. It's a lot easier to have more conversational meetings on Zoom than it is on YouTube. So Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind. Great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Sakyamuni Buddha, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, to the 16 guardians and all protectors of their Dharma and their relations throughout space and time, to all ancestors of this Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance. Let all karma be resolved and the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this Sangha. May their vows be fully realized, and may they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for all those suffering from violence and those who grieve for them, for those living in oppression, for all who are in prison who should be free, for all refugees from violence, hunger, and catastrophes, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, those working toward the healing of those afflictions. We especially pray for those suffering from COVID-19 and those working to protect and treat them, and for those grieving to those lost to this pandemic. At this time, we have members of our congregations who are suffering from disease and who are grieving for losses. We pray for them and send loving thoughts their way. May they be serene through all their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Mahapranya Paramita. So a couple of things before I go. One is that I think I've mentioned this before, but last I heard, the plan is still to reopen White Sands on the first Sunday in July. So unless that changes, I'll be back there. And if you go to White Sands regularly and you would like to help with me do live streaming from White Sands, let me know, because I don't know that the capacity to do it from the laptop that they use to run services with I don't know what the situation is, but I know that there's, I believe that there's Wi-Fi now in the meditation hall because they had it for the Buddha's birthday service. So assuming that that was a long-term thing and that we can do that, then we should be able to live stream from there. But I don't want to put more on the people who are already showing up and running services and everything else. So if you have an interest in helping with that, please email me and let me know. And then the other thing is we're looking at returning to the UU Church on Wednesday nights, so I'll talk about that more on Wednesday. So thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you again soon.